So I welcome everyone to this webinar on organized crime and economic growth, evidence from Mafia infiltrated municipalities in Italy. My name is Ricardo Morel. I'm the director of the Peace and Recovery Program at Innovation for Poverty Action, or IPA, and I'll be moderating this event. Today is the 5th webinar in our series on crime and violence in Latin America and the Caribbean, and it's co-hosted by IPA, the Becker-Friedman Institute at the University of Chicago, and Princeton University. We have also today with us Christopher Blackman, which is a Rameli E. Pearson Professor of Global Conflict Studies at the University of Chicago, and also co-organizer of this webinar series with Mika Sviacci, who is an assistant professor at Princeton University. So I'll hand it over to Chris to give a brief introduction about the crime and violence in Latin America and the Caribbean webinar series, and then we can continue. Please, Chris, the floor is yours.
Thanks, everyone. So just briefly, Mika and I, who's my co-organizer on this, just see a real lack of concrete policy discussions and concrete research on what to do about a hugely important topic, which is organized crime. This is something, it's a problem in my home city of Chicago. It's a problem in Colombia, where I work extensively. It's a growing problem across parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where I also do some work. And there's very few forums for researchers to come together, let alone policymakers to come together. And so this is really our attempt to create a dialogue. And so if this is something you're interested in, we have terrific speakers coming up. We try to do this roughly monthly. So sign up for our mailing list and attend and share it widely, because we'd sort of like to do as much as possible. And if you have questions about the research, if you have questions about how can I do this in my city, if you're a policymaker, if you're working in an organization that's working with these populations, really anywhere in the world, you can reach out to Ricardo. You can reach out to IP in general and try to get more information on what's going on and what might be relevant to your case. So thank you so much.
So I hope you can see my screen and you can hear me. I'm very, very happy to be here today. I want to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to talk about this work, which is joint work with Raffaele Saggio, who is at UBC. So without further ado, let's jump straight into it. The fight against organized crime is central to the political agenda of both developed and developing countries. And just to give you a sense of how pervasive this phenomenon is, the United Nations estimated that transnational crime worldwide made about 870 billion US dollars in 2009. So this is huge. And key to the economic success of the criminal organizations is their ability to infiltrate the local institutions. The fertile environment generated by the corrupt institutions allows organized crime to move from predatory crimes to other types of crimes that are a little bit more profitable, like construction or bid rigging or vote buying. And this is why in the Italian folklore, organized crime is represented as an octopus whose tentacles reach for everything and they try to grab anything they can touch. So what do we know about organized crime and growth? There is some evidence that organized crime negatively impacts economic activity, and some recent evidence from Latin America that it limits the mobility of the residents. There is a vibrant literature that studies how organized crime developed and prospered. And the older papers were focusing on the mafia primarily, but the most recent work is actually focusing on Latin America. So that's an exciting new development. And the problem is that much less is known about the policies that are effective at fighting organized crime and what the economic impact of those policies are. So today I'm going to talk about one policy that appears to be quite effective, but I'd like to caveat this discussion by saying that unfortunately there are other policies that have shown to produce some unintended consequences. So what we're looking at today is one positive example, but certainly not the only one. So what we're going to discuss is the long-run economic impact of the arguably most aggressive policy aimed at fighting the mafia in Italy, and this policy is called the City Council dismissal. For those who are interested in the technical side of the paper, there is not going to be much of it today, but we're going to use the difference in difference design, and I'm happy to talk about that offline if you're keen on it. We use very rich administrative data that come from multiple sources, including social security records, public finances, and real estate prices. What we find, in a nutshell, is that the City Council dismissal fosters long-run economic growth. More specifically, it increases formal employment by roughly 17% 9 years after the dismissal. And there is some evidence that while some of this employment growth may be driven by a shift from the informal to the formal sector, there is also some share of this growth that is actual economic growth and an increase in economic activity as proxied by industrial real estate prices. In the second part of the paper, we try to understand what are the mechanisms that drive these large employment gains. And turns out that the quality of the local politicians elected in the aftermath of the intervention are key in this setting. And what the politicians appear to be doing is that they appear to be changing tax compliance and public spending. We also document some positive spillover effects on neighboring municipalities. And this is exciting because it seems that this policy is not improving one place at the expense of others, at least in a small radius. So let me quickly give you an outline of the talk. It's really standard. We're going to talk about the institutional background. I'm going to describe the data and briefly mention the empirical strategy, or at least the intuition behind it. And then we're going to look at the results. The results section is structured in 3 parts. We're going to go through the main findings. We're going to try to understand whether these main findings reflect an increase in economic activity, and we're going to conclude with a discussion on the mechanisms. The City Council dismissal is a policy that was introduced in 1991 in Italy as a response to the growing influence of the mafia on local governments. And if a municipality is found to be infiltrated by the mafia, all its public elected officials are replaced by a team of external commissioners who run the city for a period of about 2 years. The external commissioners have the same powers of the dismissed officials, and at the end of their mandate, new elections are going to take place, and whoever wins the election is going to be in charge of leading the city afterwards. It's really interesting to understand how this policy is initiated. So these policies triggered by any evidence that suggests a connection between the mafia and the local government. So what I mean by that is that this policy has a purely preventive purpose. It's not meant to sanction illicit behavior ex post. It's meant to prevent illicit behavior from happening. And it typically gets initiated by ongoing independent police investigations on the personal life of local politicians and municipality bureaucrats. But in many instances, it has also been initiated by investigations on extortions, on drug trafficking, on money laundering, vote buying, and so on and so forth. Interestingly, there is no evidence that this procedure is used to get rid of political opponents. And there might be a reason for that. Namely, the fact that the law establishes a very rigid timeline through which all the parties that are involved in this procedure have to go. And this rigid timeline is meant to limit the possible abuses of this policy. So once the evidence on the connections between the local government and organized crime emerges, this is brought to the attention of the prefetto, who is the representative of the Ministry of Interior in the province. The prefetto issues an investigation, and within 3 months, they have to draft a report. This report is then sent to the prefetto, who reviews it and has to send it to the Ministry of Interior within 45 days. At that point, the Ministry of Interior is going to make the final decision after having consulted the cabinet. And if they deem the evidence sufficient, then this is published in the Gazzetta Ufficiale, which means it becomes law. This map shows you the Italian provinces, and the darkest shaded areas are those that experience a higher number of city council dismissals. So what you can see from the map is that the vast majority of these events take place in southern Italy. However, what might be a little bit harder to appreciate, given the fact that the map is has a very, very faint yellow, is that there are some dismissals in center Italy, and a few of them in the north as well. We leverage the reports that the Ministry of Interior has to submit to the Parliament to try to understand what do these commissioners do in practice. And so these reports basically tell you what their activities are. And what we can get from that from these documents is that the commissioners often freeze all investment on new projects to conduct an initial review. They try to focus on restoring legality, strengthening state capacity in the municipality. And sometimes they engage in urban planning and in investment in infrastructure. When we want to discuss the economic effects of the city council dismissals, well, we're basically talking about the relationship between corruption and economic growth. And it's ex ante unclear what the effect of this policy might be on the local economies. And that's because on the one hand, in Italy, there is a pervasive red tape in Italian bureaucracy. So you might think that, maybe the mafia is somewhat efficient because it helps to grease the wheels of these bureaucratic apparatus, and that might lead to an increase in economic activity. Likewise, one might think that Mafia might provide some employment opportunities in areas that are otherwise economically depressed. So that would be another argument why maybe the organized crime is not that bad for the local economy. But on the other hand, organized crime is also a friction. You can think of it as a friction or a tax, and it may keep afloat some businesses that would not be profitable otherwise. It definitely taxes firm profits. This is a form of extortion. It might prevent businesses from entering the local labor market. So all these actions would lead to a reduction in economic activity due to organized crime. So whether whether this policy leads to an increase or a decrease in organized crime and in the economic activity is going to be an empirical question. But what I want to flag now is that I want to flag a possible mechanisms through which city council dismissal may reduce corruption. So our working hypothesis is that the city council dismissal may make some residents update their beliefs on whether the mafia is an invincible enemy. So in Italy, the mafia has been around for at least a century, if not more, in many areas. So many residents are most likely aware of the presence of organized crime in their municipality. It's really evident, especially in the south. And they might think that there is nothing that the government can do to fight it. However, maybe being exposed to such a dramatic policy where the local elected officials are dismissed and the government takes over for 2 years might lead some citizens to update their beliefs and think that maybe something can be done against it, and that can be reflected in how people vote in the local elections. Before we move into the empirical analysis, let me quickly mention the data sources we are leveraging. The main source of data is the matched employer-employee dataset for Italy. So this dataset contains the employment histories of all private sector employees, and it also includes a registry of all firms with at least one employee. Again, this is formal employment, and this is going to be really important when we look at the results in 5 minutes or so. We get the list of the City Council dismissals from the decrees of the President of the Republic, and we complement these data sources with detailed data on house prices, population, and municipality balance sheet. Finally, the last piece of data that we use is the publicly available registry of politicians in Italy. And this is a great resource for all the students who are in the room and they're interested in these topics. What I'm going to do next is that I'm going to briefly mention the empirical strategy, and I will try to provide the intuition behind it. If you're interested in the technical details, please do ask me about it later, and I'm more than happy to discuss them offline as well. So because we want to understand what are the effects of this policy, ideally, what we want to compare is what happens to municipalities that go through a city council dismissal with what would have happened to those same municipalities in the absence of the intervention. Now, the latter is called counterfactual. And because we do not observe that counterfactual, we have to construct it. So we have to find a set of controlled municipalities that are observationally similar to the treated ones. And we do so using a procedure that is called nearest neighbor propensity score matching. And then once we have the treated units and this set of counterfactual units, we can compare how their outcomes evolve over time. So this is the exercise we're gonna be doing in the next 15 minutes or so. Before moving to that, let me just give you a quick sense of what do these municipalities look like. These municipalities are fairly small on average. We're talking about municipalities that have 15,000 inhabitants, so quite small, I would say. The average municipality has approximately 258 firms and approximately 257 establishments. So this means that the vast majority of these firms are rather small and they have at most one establishment. So this is a setting where really distinguishing between establishment and firms is not going to be a first order problem. But something that is really important is that our data is uniquely suited to study small businesses. And this is something that other sources of data lack, because it's typically really hard to track these small businesses. So if you're interested in doing this type of work and you have access to data on small businesses, I think that's a huge advantage, especially in this setting. The average municipality has about 1,600 workers employed in the private sector. This number is fairly low. It's a low percentage of the overall population. And there are a few reasons why this number is so low. First of all, these are municipalities that are located in southern Italy, primarily. And these municipalities tend to have high unemployment rates, low female participation rates, so women don't work as much, and large informal sector. And finally, many people work in government, and our data set does not contain information on government employees. Let's now move to the main findings. I'm going to describe this graph in detail because we are going to look at many graphs that look like this one. So on the horizontal axis here, we have event time. So what this means is that the year 0 is the year in which the municipality goes through the dismissal. Year 1 is going to be the year after that, year 2 is 2 years after that, and so on and so forth. So negative numbers correspond to the years prior to the dismissal, and the positive numbers correspond to years after the intervention. Another important feature of this graph is that we marked 0 with a horizontal dashed line. And what this means is that we're going to be comparing how the outcome of interest, in this case, employment, changes before and after the intervention. So we're going to be comparing all the years after the intervention. So these are the years that you see on the right side of the graph, relative to the year prior to the intervention. And if you see that these dots are above this horizontal line, it means that the intervention had a positive impact on the variable of interest. If the dots are below the 0 line, it means it has a negative impact. So for those who are interested in the technical details, we see that in the years leading up to the intervention, there are no strong pretrends. Maybe there is a little bit, but is definitely going in the opposite direction as the main effect we will estimate. And then what we see is that in the first year of the intervention, employment increases a little bit, but the impact is quite small and definitely not statistically significant. But starting from here, year 3, something changes quite dramatically, and employment starts growing and keeps on growing until, year 7 or 8 after the intervention. So this is important because year 3 is not a random time in the life of the municipality, is the time in which new elections have taken place and the new class of politicians is gonna take office. And we're gonna see in the mechanism section that, this is gonna be a very important observation. And many of the graphs we're going to look at today will show that something seems to be really changing around year 3. The final comment I'd like to make about this graph is about the size of these effects. So if you take these point estimates literally, you'll see that these point estimates mean that 9 years after the intervention, employment increases by roughly 17%. So this might look like an absurdly huge number, but in fact it's not. So this is a large percentage change starting from a very low base. So if you remember, the average municipality has about 1,600 people employed in the private sector. So a 17% increase over such a small base would be something on the order of 280 additional workers. This graph looks at the number of firms in those municipalities, and it has a very similar shape to the graph we looked at before. And again, what this graph is telling you is that the number of firms in those municipalities increases, but it seems to increase starting from year 3, while the first 3 years don't really show much of an effect. Finally, this graph tells us something about average earnings. And what we see here is that average earnings in treaty municipalities decrease on impact relative to the matched counterfactual, but that the vast majority of these effects accrue starting from year 3. And we have some additional analysis that shows that a large share of this decrease in average earnings is in fact driven by the workers who enter the local labor markets, and these new entrants have on average a wage that is lower than the prevailing wage, and that's driving down this mean. So let me just summarize what we found. So far we found that city council dismissals increase formal employment, increase the number of firms, and decrease average earnings. We also found some evidence that I didn't present to you yet on the fact that this intervention has positive spillovers on surrounding municipalities. And you see that the pattern of results is similar, qualitatively similar, but the point estimates are smaller, as you would expect when you study spillover effects. So it means that it also increases formal employment in the surrounding municipalities, at least to some extent. However, because the vast majority of these interventions take place in southern Italy, where a large fraction of the employment is informal, one might be concerned that the effects we're picking up are a mere reallocation from the informal to the formal sector. And let me just stress that, if that was all we found, it would not be that bad at all, because these are now people that are going to be part of the formal sector. They're going to have paid vacation, paid sick leave, they're going to pay taxes. So if this was just a reallocation, it wouldn't be a defeat after all. But of course, we would be more excited if some of these was actual growth. So let's see what we can say about that. In order to understand whether city council dismissals have any real economic effect, we would love to have a proxy for economic activity that incorporates both the formal and the informal sector. Unfortunately, we do not have such a proxy. So what we're going to do here is that we are going to present two pieces of evidence that suggest that at least a sizable share of the employment effects we find are driven by actual economic growth and not a mere reallocation. So let's look at these two pieces of evidence. So the first piece of evidence is the share of workers who appear for the first time in the social security records. So these are people who have never held formal job in the private sector before. And here we see the pattern we have seen many, many times. So, not much is happening until year 2. And then starting from year 3, we see that the share of these workers starts increasing, and it keeps on increasing thereafter. Now, if the workers that appeared for the first time in the social security records were 40-year-old people or 50-year-old people, that would be a strong indication that these are workers who were probably employed informally before, and after the city council dismissal, they find a formal job. So we look at what share of this effect is driven by young workers, defined as workers who are younger than 30 years old. And we see that the vast majority of this effect is driven by young workers. So this is some evidence, some suggestive evidence that these are real employment gains, and these are not simply a mere reallocation from the informal to the formal sector. We look at another piece of evidence, which is the industrial real estate prices. So under the assumption that the supply of industrial real estate is rather fixed, then an increase in real estate prices can be interpreted as an increase in local economic activity. And we see that this graph has pretty much the same shape as the graph on log employment, meaning that the city council dismissal leads to an increase in industrial real estate prices 9 years after the policy takes place. And we interpret this as evidence of increased economic activity and not simply a mere reallocation from the informal to the formal sector. There are two more comments I'd like to make on this graph. So in the interest of time, I couldn't include too many graphs, but I'd like to say that we also look at house prices, and we do not find an effect on house prices nor on population. So it doesn't look like that, people from surrounding municipalities decide to move to the municipalities that experience a city council dismissal, and that might be driving up the economic activity. It seems this is really driven by economic activity alone. So in the last 5 minutes of the talk, I want to try to understand a little bit more the mechanisms. So we have seen that the vast majority of the effects start materializing from year 3, which is the time in which the newly elected politicians take charge of the municipality. So we think this is not a mere coincidence, and we replicate some of the results that Gianmarco, who's here today, and his co-author did in their 2015 paper, and we find that the newly elected politicians are 13 percentage points more likely to be newcomers. So these are people who have never had a political appointment before. 16% more likely to be female, a little bit more highly educated, and a little bit younger on average, suggesting that, overall, the political class really changed. And in order to offer some evidence that it's really the local politicians who are driving these employment gains, we perform our analysis on two subsets of municipalities. So we look at what happens in the municipalities that experience a large change in the composition of local politicians, and these are the blue triangles on this graph. And we compare those effects with those in municipalities that do not really experience a large change in local politicians after the city council dismissal. And what this graph is telling us is that the vast majority of the effect is indeed driven by those municipalities that experience a large change in the composition of local politicians. So again, this is suggestive evidence that politicians are the key factor, the main driver in this setting. Finally, we try to look at what these politicians do in practice, and we find that they change how they collect taxes, and they also change local spending. So more specifically, they increase tax compliance, and they also increase the expenditure share. And a large part of these is driven by an increase in the budget share for the administrative expenses, and this is in line with the reports that the Ministry of Interior sends to the Parliament on the activities of the commissioners. And there is also some suggestive evidence that the local politicians increase the budget share devoted to infrastructures, roads, and environment. I think I have probably a couple of minutes left, so let me conclude. In this paper, we evaluate the long-run impact of the fight against organized crime in Italian municipalities. We do find that this policy, the city council dismissal, is effective at fostering long-run economic growth. More specifically, we find an increase in formal employment of roughly 17%. And some of these is definitely a reallocation from the informal to the formal sector, but not entirely. And it appears that the main mechanism driving these effects is the fact that there is a dramatic change in the political class of local politicians, that these newly elected politicians are less likely to have been elected before. These are newcomers, and they bring some fresh blood to the municipality, and that translates into changes in improvement in tax compliance and changes in public spending. So overall, what we can say is that in this specific setting, we find that there are large, long-run economic benefits associated with targeted law enforcement action against organized crime. But I just want to emphasize that I'm sure that Gianmarco will talk more about it in the next few slides, in the next few minutes. The fact that this is an example of a successful policy, but there is some recent research that shows that other policies have not been as successful, and other policies in Latin America have had some negative unintended consequences. So I just want to highlight that this is one example of something that apparently worked, but one should be really careful in simply, adopting the same policy elsewhere and expecting the same type of economic growth. So this is all I have. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks for inviting me. Thanks, Alessandra, for the very nice and interesting presentation. So I'll have 10 minutes with some policy comments on this paper. So let me start saying that this is a very salient, strong intervention, which is also under revision by the Italian government. It has been under revision for many years to try to make it better. It's very salient because every time there is a dissolution, usually you can find it on local media and very often also on national media. So it's something in Italy everybody knows about this policy. It's a strong intervention because the dissolution concerns democratically elected politicians. So it's very strong policy, as Alessandra also highlighted. And I agree with her that in general, this policy worked. And I would say it works because it has been in place for 30 years. In 30 years in Italy, we changed 5 different electoral laws. So the fact that this policy has been in place, it's kind of amazing. However, this policy doesn't always work. Indeed, we have many cases of city council dissolved more than once, 2 or 3 cases. And this concern about 50 municipalities, which have been dissolved twice. About 20%, 25% of the total. After many years, there are still 2 cases of cities in which nobody wants to run, because basically there is no alternative to this political class connected to the mafia. Then there was a recent survey on the commissioners, so on the bureaucrats that rule the city, and they are not very happy with the citizen. They find in more than 50% of the cases, they find citizen as indifferent toward the dissolution of the city council. And they also report that the local bureaucrats working in the city hall are kind of hostile to this technocratic government. So all of this to say that it's not obvious that we are going to find this positive economic effect that Alessandra showed us. So this is very important, and this is certainly the main policy comment, the main policy message of this paper. So that on average, fighting corruption, in this case it's mafia ties, not only restores legality, but it actually has an important positive economic effects in terms of formal employment and industrial real estate prices. So this is particularly important because we know that in many cases this policy doesn't really work. So having a proper evaluation of this policy, it's very important. And the message is it can work. It can really work to fight corruption and in turn have a positive effect on the local economy. So comment number 2, it's about the mechanism. Why is it working? Alessandra told us about politician ability, and I'm very sympathetic as I wrote a paper on this. However, for sure, there are other important things going on. So I think the most important concern the private sector, private companies that operate, that work in the municipality, that can now work in a different way because they know that the state is there, and for the mafia will be more difficult to influence them. So this is certainly very important. It's very difficult to pin it down, I think, with the data, but it's definitely something that matters to understand why this has such a positive effect on the economic growth. So this is a kind of an open question, I believe, if we want to understand why this is working. Comment number 3, it's about a complementary policy that it's often enforced when there is a dissolution of a city council, that is property confiscation. So as Alessandra said, when there is this dissolution, usually there are investigations. So these investigations might end up with trials or people affiliated to mafia, and in turn this leads to confiscation of firms affiliated to the mafia, or confiscation of property, real estate property. So this is a very powerful policy because the confiscation includes the relatives who may have played the role of frontman or cover up for the mafia. So it's a very extensive policy. And usually the government passes on confiscated assets to civil society or NGO. So this is a bit how it works, and I believe this is very complementary to city council dissolution. And we can see this from this graph, in which on the right you see the number of city council dissolution over time, and on the left you see the value of seized assets to the mafia. And you can see that they follow a very similar trend. So I really believe that the two policies go on simultaneously in Italy. So just to give you an idea, in many years, the Italian government seized to Mafia more than 1 billion euros. So very high amount. Comment number 4, about the external interest for other countries, specifically in Latin America. So I believe this is a very strong intervention because it concerns the removal of democratically elected local politicians without conclusive evidence of mafia ties. So the recent trial here, this is an articulated but fast process that can take up 6 months without conclusive evidence. It's a kind of preventive measure. And indeed, there has been, like so far, 23 cases, about almost 10%, a bit less, of revoked dissolutions. So afterwards, the Italian government realized they were wrong. So, you know, it's obviously what seems to be a connection to mafia, it doesn't always is after a trial, a proper investigation, longer. So I highlight this because I think there is a very high risk of political manipulation, especially in contexts in which we are not so sure about the quality of institutions. This can concern Italy, can concern other countries as well. So this is important, again, why? Because there is this intervention without conclusive evidence. So there might be manipulation. A possible solution, I don't know, but it might be to set up an anti-corruption authority. So this decision might be taken instead that from the government, it can be taken by an independent, not politically elected authority. Last comment, still about the external interest. I think in context of low trust toward institutions and towards the national government, local bureaucrats and citizens might be hostile to external imposed technocrats. And this might deter the positive effects. So we saw this happening in Italy in some cases that I highlighted above. And I think this can be a problem also when we think about this intervention in other countries. So the bottom line here is that city council dissolution must be perceived as rightfully motivated. In the previous comment, I highlighted the role of an anti-corruption authority implementing this. Here instead, I want to highlight as a final point the role of selecting the commissioners that are going to rule the city. They need very specific skills. Indeed, in Italy, this has been more a learning by doing process. And now the law is under revision, considering a debate on how to train the commissioner to rule cities, because they are really playing the role of politicians without being a politician. Okay, so I think I'm right on time. This was my last comment, and thanks again, everyone, for being here.